Well, welcome, and thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Martha Oakes, and I'm the curator of the museum. And tonight we're presenting the final program in a series of programs put together to go with our special exhibition Design Build. Now in its final weeks, the exhibition explores the architectural firm of Phillips and Halloran, a practice that was in business here in Gloucester for about 70 years. During the course of the exhibition, we've engaged audiences with gallery talks, with presentations by several architects practicing in the region today, and through a series of narrated walking tours that got people out into various neighborhoods around Cape Ann to look at architecture. We've also presented lectures and workshops in collaboration with Historic New England, and also explored how photography can enhance people's appreciation of architecture. And tonight, we'll hear from Lyda Kuth, an independent documentary filmmaker who has spent many months researching the life and the accomplishments of Eleanor Raymond, an architect with intimate connections to Cape Ann. And we first met Lyda, must have been almost a year ago, when she came here to the museum to work in our archives. And we were intrigued and excited about her project, and we're very fortunate that she's agreed to share some of her work with us today. In addition to being a filmmaker, Lyda is the executive director of the LEF Foundation, which supports creative endeavors, including in the area of film, here in New England and on the West Coast. And Lyda was recognized for her work in 1999 by the Mass Cultural Council with their prestigious Commonwealth Award. So again, thank you for being here tonight, and why don't you join with me in welcoming Lyda to the microphone.
So thank you all for coming, and I hope I don't disappoint. There will be no moving image tonight, no moving images. What got me started on this journey of finding out who Eleanor Raymond was is, I would tell that in a little bit more detail, but the research I've done over the last year was sort of seeing if it was something I would make a film about or not. And I still don't know the answer to that, but it certainly was something that I was very happy to have a talk with still images about. So I think what you'll find most enchanting today and tonight are going to be these images. I want to just start out by acknowledging people who sort of pioneered well ahead of me in researching who Eleanor Raymond was. Now, can I just have a quick, I can't see your hands, but who's familiar with Eleanor Raymond? I know some people in this room really are. Okay, good. It's like half. That's wonderful. So yes, there are some people who've met Eleanor Raymond. Who's met Eleanor Raymond? Oh, that's so great. I have to find you later. Please come up to me, please, because I want to talk to you. I want to just acknowledge really what a lot of my research, drew from and was really dependent on. And one of those is Doris Cole, who couldn't make it tonight. She was an architect herself and a scholar, and she wrote really the only book on Eleanor Raymond in 1981 called Eleanor Raymond, Architect. And next came along a young graduate student at BU who in 1998 wrote a dissertation called Building Context, the Personal and Professional Life of Eleanor Raymond, Architect. And I also want to acknowledge the archivists who have helped me over this year's journey, and three of them are here, which I'm so thrilled about. Two of them from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, Inez Zalduendo, who's right there. You can raise your hand. And Artis Cosbial, who is next to her. And next to her, because of course they know each other, is Lorna Condon from Historic New England. So I also want to thank Martha Oakes, because that's why I'm here tonight. And Stephanie Buck, who works in the archives, is not here, but she was my first connection when I was down there digging around, trying to figure out where Eleanor Raymond's house and cottage were and if it still existed. And she said to me, Lyda, I think Martha might know. I think she knows the people who live in Eleanor Raymond's cottage. I'm like, are you kidding me? And so sure enough, she introduced me to the people who still live there, and they're here tonight too, and that's Anne Seymour St. John and Albert Ellis, and they're right there. So thank you for coming very much. And they were very welcoming and allowed me to do a lot of poking around at their house. And I promised some images of that later. So I have what I hoped is a somewhat provocative, interesting slide up there. Eleanor Raymond, for those of you who were brought along, your spouse brought you along, or otherwise partner, and you have no idea who Eleanor Raymond is, she was a woman architect who, as they would say, practiced between the war years. So we're talking the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And she had, this is something that she built for her sister in 1931. And you'll be hearing more about that later. But what's curious about Eleanor Raymond is that she had some major accomplishments, like this very early modernist building. And she's not very well known. And I think there's kind of a number of reasons for that. I would probably start with her being a woman, certainly back at her era, and continuing up until today. That's one of the reasons, I would say. But let me give you a little insight into how my journey started with Eleanor Raymond. I learned about a house that was in Belmont, and it was being renovated. And it was by a woman architect. And I was like, and from the 1930s, I went, that's such a great era. And there was this beautiful staircase that was still in this house, very modern, very, very beautiful. And I got very curious about who this was. And so I came to learn, here's a photo of the outside of that house, the Miller House. And this was a house that she would have built in the 30s. Here is another picture of Rachel Raymond's house, the color slide there, again, 1930s. And I came to learn that she'd done a handful of these modernist houses. Here's another one, the Frost House, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And closer to home, we have this beautiful, small, modern, we have this, in this beautiful setting, this small modern house. Here it is a little more close up, and this is the Pope House, and that would have been the 1940s. And here is a view looking out from that house. Clearly, a very modernist sensibility. So I was like, who is this person? And then sort of the crown of her achievement, again, I had never heard of her, is she built the first solar house in the United States that was occupied. And it's not a name that's like in the conversation, very surprising. And here is a picture of that solar house, south-facing windows. Here's another one I love in the winter. It's quite lovely. So I want to kind of turn to her biography now a little bit and say, where'd she come from? Who was she? Eleanor Raymond was born in 1887. She lived to 1989, and for those of you who can't do the math fast like me, that's 102 years. Those are real numbers. This woman lived over a century, which is why some of the people in this room know her. Extraordinary. Here's a picture of her kind of in midlife. She always wore that character. She always wore hats, and she wore that beret all the time. It was great. So she lived through a lot of historic events and a lot of cultural and social changes. World War I, she would have been in her early 20s, just graduating from college. The Depression, she was a practicing architect at that time. World War II, that would have been in her mid-career. And so she was, all of those historical events had an impact on her life. And culturally, I think we look back now at this time as being incredibly rich and vibrant and full of change. And, one of those big tidal waves was what was happening for the status of women at that time. And Eleanor Raymond was of like the third or fourth generation of women to be able to go to the women colleges and become educated. And all of a sudden, women had options. It was very narrow, very slim, but they were there. They had never been there before. You have women who don't want to necessarily go and get married. You have men who don't necessarily want to marry educated women, and that's a fact. And there weren't many professional paths open to them. So but they created, they found ways to live and shape their own lives that were not the get married, have children. And Eleanor was really an example of that. She took full advantage of these options and this possibility at that time. You'll hear more about that. The other thing that I shaped her life, particularly her career, was European modernism. And she was introduced to that in the 1930s. And that, for her and even for us looking back, that's still a very vibrant and rich time, bringing those kinds of sensibilities that were very quite new. And I just want to say that in terms of Eleanor's life, she never married, which was somewhat typical of some educated women. She was able to pursue a professional career, which was actually fairly unique as an architect. And she also had a life partner with Ethel Power, someone that she met in her late 20s. And they were together for 50-some years, and they set up their own idea of family and home. So you hear more about her as well. So I'm now going to show this wonderful picture of her as a small child. And I'm guessing, I don't know, maybe 10, I'm not sure. And she was born into a family, middle class, fairly well-to-do. When middle class was actually well-to-do and you could do a lot of things in the world, like send your kids to college. She was one of 7 siblings to a Cambridge family. She was right in the middle, so she may have had some typical middle child type things. But she describes her family life, and it's not a particularly happy one. The way she puts it was, I was put on my own from the minute I was born, practically. And I've been on my own ever since. And I love this picture of her because you can see that self-reliance. You can kind of see this fierce independence that's already at work. And it served her well, actually. And she goes on to describe, again, this is probably not that unusual, my father was never interested in anything I did. My mother was in hospitals a lot of the time. Basically, I think her mother was hospitalized for psychiatric illness over numerous times. Her father was supposedly not an easy man. She probably didn't want to have 7 kids, but she did. And so there's another quote from Eleanor where she says, I think houses are so important in the background of children. So clearly there was something that she didn't get. And I think it left kind of a mark, a wound, as it were. And I think this wound made her seek home and seek to create home in the world. And I think it influenced the way she approached how she dealt with her clients and wanting to create home for them, whatever it was that they needed that to be. And she certainly created a home for herself with her life partner, Ethel. And there's also, from her class notes, she went to Wellesley, and from her class notes a few years after she graduated, she says, building homes for other people appeals to me so much more than building and taking care of one for myself. She did go to Wellesley, and I don't think she was particularly academic or scholarly. She said she went because, here she is in her freshman class. She's in the center. You can start recognizing her, that look, that stare. Class of 1909. And she went to Wellesley, she said, because they had rowing. And there's been a lot that's written about sort of what meaning these women colleges had, and sort of the astonishing effect of what it was like for these women to go from these, homes that were very traditional and suddenly find themselves in an all-female environment. This was radical. And, here they were among other women who were being educated, who were looking to broaden their lives. Their models were faculty and founding presidents of these colleges who had independent lives, generally were unmarried themselves, and often they had partners themselves as well. You hear of a lot of relationships where two women teachers at a college, lived a life together. It was a time when what we might term now and what they would call then romantic friendship between women was very sort of valued and not looked at in any way that was suspect. And here's a picture that I love. I don't know who this classmate is, but here she is. Eleanor's on the left. And here's another picture of them, very romantic, over a waterfall. I love that. Post-graduation, there was a period of about 5 years before another important thing happened to her. And in that 5-year period, like one of many middle-class educated women, she did some typical things. One was she did a European tour with her best friend and her best friend's mother. And that actually ended up being somewhat interrupted and cut short because of some of the unrest, political unrest that was already happening prior to World War I, which had been 1914. And so she came back, and again, she got involved in something that was fairly typical of the time, too. There weren't a lot of career paths for these educated women. And all of a sudden, you had this demographic of women, like, okay, where are you going to put them? You know, what are they going to do? Where are they going to live? What are they going to do? They don't want to immediately get married. And my analogy is kind of city year, or, you know, Teach for America, if any of you have young kids you've raised in this generation. Essentially, where do you put them after they graduate? They aren't ready to hold down a job or start a family. And the culture at that time, there were two places that women could land. I mean, they could become teachers, or they could also become involved in some of the social movements that were happening. One of those was women's suffrage, and another one was the settlement houses. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the settlement houses, sort of one that's very well known, would be Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago. And this was really the first time, the beginning of social work. And in fact, Smith College, at the turn of the century, created, that's how old that school is at Smith, the School of Social Work. And Boston had many settlement houses because it had a lot of immigrant, refugee coming into the city, and these women would go down and they would sort of found these, sort of create these organizations that would sort of serve the urban poor, and often they would live there as well in these settlement houses. So again, they're recreating that feminine, all-female environment, that sort of communal living. And it's known that, and it's important to know that sort of by this time, you know, these two movements, both suffrage and the settlement houses, those were kind of mainstream. You were not doing anything radical to do that, you know, because those started back 100 years before, like mid-1800s. So this was very, you know, this was like city year. It was a very acceptable thing to do. But it's known that Eleanor did work in a settlement home, and that it was noted that she was the garden director. And that's, you know, probably makes a lot of sense. I think she might have taken a botany class at Wellesley, and she was kind of exploring what she might want to do. And again, interestingly, landscape architecture was seen as a career path that maybe women could be adept at. It was kind of part of the garden, and they could oversee that. And landscape architecture and architecture were very separate disciplines. So there was a little bit of activity for women to kind of begin to carve out a career in landscape architecture, but it was very new. So Eleanor decides that she wants to be an architect, not a landscape architect. And in 1915, we're not sure if she met Ethel Power, her life partner, at the settlement house or through the Massachusetts suffragette organization. But she met Ethel when she was 28, and she was about 6 years younger than Ethel. And I've always loved to try and imagine this conversation, but she actually convinces Ethel to go to the same school that she's going to go to, which is the Cambridge School of Landscape Architecture and Architecture for Women. That's kind of a mouthful. I will refer to it henceforth as the Cambridge School. And the Cambridge School was, who's heard of the Cambridge School, this particular school? Okay, wow, even fewer people. It's a whole story in and of itself, and in fact, there was actually a book that was written called Women Design in the Cambridge School, and it was written by Dorothy May Anderson. Dorothy Mae Anderson was actually a student there, and she wrote this book. What is this date? Let me look. Forget. This would be 1980. And she realized that the history was disappearing, that the women that she had gone to school with there were in their 80s and getting older. And so she captured some of their stories in that book. But it's the history that's really disappeared, and I can tell you a little bit how that happened. Essentially, when Eleanor and Ethel enrolled in 1916 in this quote-unquote school, they were 2 of 6 students, so it was very new. It had been founded in 1915, and it literally was founded in a living room. Now, here is a picture of Henry Atherton Frost. Loved the lamp in the front, awesome. And he was the person who was the force behind the Cambridge School. What happened is there was a young woman who went to Radcliffe, and she was thinking about landscape design, and she understood she needed to know how to draft, and how was she going to learn how to do that? So she actually went to the dean. This would have been 1915. She went to the dean and said, is there a way I can get further training? And he said, well, you can't do it here because women aren't allowed to go to graduate school. They don't belong in graduate school. But I have this junior faculty member, young faculty member. Maybe he'd be willing to give you drafting lessons. So sure enough, and this is a great quote from this book, where this young woman remembers this time when she literally Frost would come to her parents' living room. They lived in Cambridgeport. She lived at home with her parents. And after a month or so, Mr. Frost said, why don't we move to our office in the Brattle building? There's a picture of where that was, where 2 or 3 other students would like to join us. I think this is a futile performance here, where you can't sling ink about and must gather up all the eraser crumbs so they won't fall into the oriental rug. So I think that, I think Henry Atherton kind of backed into this project, and it really became his lifelong passion. And in the beginning, they disseminated a little catalog, and each year it became more and more robust, more women applied, and they began offering everything from interior decorating to architecture, very rigorous curriculum. And when, in the beginning days, the Harvard faculty would refer to it as he was in this building, and the Brattle building, he was in practice with another man named Bremer Pond. And they would refer to this little class happening in their office as the Frost and Pond Day Nursery. But the college, this institution, which could not be accredited, that was one of the issues. These women were able to go to school, get really fine training, but they were not accredited. But they still would go out in the world and try and find work, and it had a growing reputation. But women were not given advanced degrees at this time. So, they were given, again, it was a woman philanthropist who bought a building for them right in the heart of Harvard Square, and they put an addition on it. And this is what was built there. And you can see it has a kind of modernist sensibility to it. And it's still there. And here is what it looks like today. You can still see where the windows were. And this little yellow house in the front, that was the initial building that they had it's still 53 Church Street. I walk by it all the time. And I only recently, with my research assistant, Michael, discovered the back, and he took that picture for me. So the Cambridge School was seminal. It was a place that actually, I think, Frost had a little more freedom with which to teach, and there was a passionate belief in sort of that landscape architecture, interior design and architecture should all be taught together. They shouldn't be in different silos, which was very different than what had been happening prior to this. And they would go on like 6-week vacations to Europe together, and they even founded another school opened up in the summer in Rockport, actually. Small little school was there as well. Haven't found the address for that yet, but I'm going to try and track that down. But it was again, much like what these women would have experienced in going to college, a very vibrant atmosphere, and one that would be hard, I think, to leave behind. So this is a next stage in Eleanor Raymond's story, which is what you're looking at here, if you can read it, is an announcement that Henry Atherton Frost and Eleanor Raymond are going to open a practice together in Harvard Square. So clearly she was very talented. Clearly she worked very, very hard, and her mentor became her business partner. And she did not stay with him that long, maybe 9 years, and then after that she launched into her own practice. So despite what Eleanor said about not wanting to make home for herself, especially maintain that home, which that did remain true. She hated housekeeping and cooking. But she actually managed to create 2 beautiful domiciles for herself. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. The first one, or one of them I want to, close to home, is Muscle Point. And there's a picture of the cottage that I think that she and Ethel probably bought that around the 1930s. There was a letter from abroad where she said she was looking at things to maybe bring back to the house, and that was her trip in 1930. So she owned that. And the second was, there's another picture of that cottage. And the second was this. And you can see that in one time the building has a front, and then it doesn't have a front. And it actually has to be read from left to right, because Eleanor bought in 1923, she finished the renovation of a townhouse that she bought in that condition that had no facade. The Charles Street was being expanded, and they just lopped off the front of it, which I wouldn't have known was even possible. And Eleanor, being sensitive to the typology and the streetscape, she was very happy and content to recreate something that was very much in line with what the rest of the street looked like. Here's a picture of what the townhouse, and it looks like this still to this day, but this would have been like from about 1960, which my husband helped me identify because he could read what year those cars were. I had no idea. That's about 1960. And what she did was, when she had an extraordinary living situation there, and again, it embodied some of the changes that were happening for women and the ways that they were trying to kind of invent their lives in unconventional ways. She actually lived there with her partner, Ethel Power. She renovated an apartment that was 2 floors at the top, and lived there with Rachel, her younger sister, who she clearly was very close to. So they had 2-floor apartment, and I believe we may be looking at that in this drawing. And then I want you to also note, you see how there's that little L that comes off there, the loggia? Well, what Eleanor did is, having lost some of the front of the building, she built something onto the back. And this is what that addition would have looked like and how it would have read back into a sitting room. It's very beautiful. And then here's an interior shot, sort of what their house might have looked like. And so to go back to who the occupants were, in the center on the 2nd floor was Mrs. Raymond, their mother. And clearly, kind of based on her history, she probably needed some caretaking, and the father had since passed away. And then on the street level, the 1st floor, were 2 twin sisters, Mary P. Cunningham, known as MP, and Florence Cunningham. And I want to come back to Cape Ann and to Martha and Stephanie, because when I came here to find out about Eleanor Raymond, I also knew who had lived in that house on Charles Street, and one of them's name was Florence Cunningham, and there was a Florence connected to the Gloucester. Oh my God, so I never get this right. The Gloucester School of the Little Theater. Who has heard of that It ran for many years on Rocky Neck and had different, I think, incarnations. Florence, one of the two twins, ran that school every summer. So there was already this connection, I think, up to Gloucester. And her sister, Mary MP, was a very dear friend of Eleanor and Ethel's. She spent almost every weekend up at Muscle Point, and she herself was a landscape architect. So back to the house and how that was laid out. Down here you can see there is this garden room, and that is below street level. I've actually visited this townhouse and met the woman who owns it. And I was able to go into this garden room. It's much the same it was. I mean, all the basic structure is there. And that's part of what Eleanor was able to add on. And you can see that they did a great deal of design work on the garden. And here's a picture of what that would have looked like at the time. And what was extraordinary is she had a view that went all the way down to the Charles River. And I don't have the year that she sold that house, but when she sold it, they had, probably was in like, I don't know, it could have been the 1970s maybe. But maybe when all the they erected an enormous building that sort of sits right over Sterl Drive, and it blocked her view. And she sold it, and she said, I'm never coming back here ever again. So I now want to kind of turn away from her biography a little bit and talk more about her professional trajectory and what some of the architectural influences were on that. I have 3 images here. In the top left, we have the Bauhaus, which is clearly the modernist influence. Gropius's Bauhaus in Germany. And next to that is what looks like to us a very kind of mundane piece of architecture. I think we drive past that every day in numerous Boston suburbs, in New England. But this would have been what was known as colonial revivalism. And colonial revivalism had kind of these, some of the elements were the gambrel roof and some others that would have looked like this. It was, while it looks very conservative to us, it was, pretty au courant, and it was being practiced and taught, and architects were designing buildings like this. And from their point of view, they were harking back to an earlier time, drawing some influences from what would be Georgian and Federalist style buildings, where they would have very symmetrical use of the windows. They'd have a simple center door with a pediment. And here's another example of that. They often had dormers. And this was a style that was like, had an influence like from the mid 1800s to like 1950s. So this was a pretty predominant style in which most of her clients wanted their houses to be built. And we see a lot of these houses, don't we, these days. And so her opportunities to experiment with modernism were few and far between. And when they did happen, they were invariably women patrons, actually, who also had similarly unconventional lives and had some resources with which to, partner with Eleanor on these houses. I'll show you some examples in a minute. I think the other one down here in the corner is something we might just look at that and go, oh, yeah, that's a farm building. Yeah, I've seen that before, big deal. Well, actually, that was a vernacular, and it was something near and dear to Eleanor's heart. And once again, she was partaking in what was a fairly, in a movement that was happening during the Depression, where, as they looked, one of the things that was part of the New Deal was something called the American Buildings Survey. And as with many of the other WPA programs, they were looking to provide employment. And the American Buildings Survey was something to provide employment to unemployed architects, interior designers, landscape architects, and in some cases perhaps engineers. And what they set out to do, actually, was to do measurements and document all these early American buildings, because in that same spirit of other WPA programs, it was about looking at what was authentically American and celebrating that. So her book, which she published in 1931, beautiful frontispiece of that book, she went to look at the early domestic architecture of Pennsylvania, and here's a couple of the pictures from that book. These buildings really were from the 1700s, probably. There's a treatment of sort of outside. Here's another treatment of outside. And what she began to love about this was the way that these outbuildings clustered around each other and created a kind of courtyard, or created a relationship between themselves. And you start to see her, that's reflected in her later work when she's thinking about interior versus exterior. Here is one of the very, modest kitchens, but if you look at it, it actually has some real sense of modernism to it. If you stop to look at the beam and you look at the clean line of the window and the opening, and she herself, as I said, this would have been she would have undertaken this study and finished the book in 1931, and so she had been exposed to modernism. It was on her mind, and in the foreword of her book, she has this wonderful quote where she talks about the similarities between modernism and these early vernacular buildings, and seeing that and bringing attention to that. And she called it the so-called modern, in quotes, movement, which I just loved, because we don't put modern in quotes anymore. But then it was like this new so-called style. And she said that, observation of the modern movement, both abroad and at home, along with a close study of these Pennsylvania buildings, will clearly show that the motives and the ideal are both the same. And she goes on to explain that. She says, one can perceive how sincerely, and I love the use of that word, kind of had integrity, sincerely these houses and farm buildings manifest their function. Form follows function, very much of a modernist ideal, and how perfectly they are adapted to site, another thing that the modernists were thinking about, and how simply they are expressed in the best materials at hand, something else the modernists were, putting value on. And she goes on to say, and one observes such simple, and I want to go back to this image because I love it so much, and one observes such simple expedients as the shade value of a tree over the spring house. And when I show you later images of Muscle Point, you'll see where she created and was thinking about those kinds of exterior spaces, creating rooms to the outside. So let's see, where am I? Oh, I just wanted to throw up, here's another image from the Pennsylvania houses. And again, you'll see this reflected in what she was designing later in the 30s and 40s. Here's an example of that. And here it gets even a little bit more modern. So these are very classical details that she valued and integrated into her work. So now I just want to talk a little bit about those female patrons that I had referred to earlier. And here's an image again of the Rachel Raymond house, which really was an extraordinary house, beautiful. And Rachel lived there for 11 years with another woman who I think was more than a business partner, Edith Kingsbury. They lived there. They eventually separated, and Rachel moved up to Essex, which was nearby where Eleanor was in Gloucester. And here is another image of that house. And I think what's important to note is this was the country. Belmont was not a suburb. It was out in the country. And it was quite, radical to have two women move to the country, build a modern house, live there themselves, And here's another image from there. So the other really important patron was Amelia Peabody. And I can't even begin to tell you where in that family tree she belongs, but she was a Peabody. And she she and Eleanor, and here this could be a movie, I think. She and Eleanor had a 40-year partnership as client and architect, and she built many, many buildings of all kinds of types for Amelia Peabody. And I want to show you some buildings that she designed, which I think you'll clearly see the influence of the vernacular here. Amelia Peabody was a big hunt, she loved to hunt, and she had horses and dogs, and she bought a big swath of land south of Boston and Dover area, and she asked Eleanor to design these beautiful farm buildings for her. And here they are in the present. They're beautifully maintained. I was just there a week ago, took these pictures. And then this is looking back at that cluster of buildings, of the farm buildings. And this view is actually from a little pathway you take a little ways onto the edge of the woods, and then you come upon this, like within, view of each other, which I love. And this is the studio that she built for Amelia Peabody. Amelia was a sculptor, and she built this for her in 1933. And here's another view of that. It sits in this farm that's privately owned, and it's sort of been preserved by benign neglect. It didn't get torn down. Development didn't come in. It wasn't made into a condominium, which I really was afraid it was. That I saw it on Google Earth, and I thought, well, there's a building, but I have no idea what's happening to it. And it basically just stores some things for these people who are there. Exercise equipment. And here's another view of that. Now here's some earlier pictures of the studio. It would have been painted white. Here's the interior. There's a description. There's so much color. It's sort of like looking at the early Greek sculptures. There's so much color in what Eleanor designed as well, because she was just attuned to everything, and she worked closely with interior designers. And the description of the colors are that for Amelia Peabody's studio, the walls are gray, shading toward green. The floor is a bright blue linoleum, and there are accents of pomegranate, a deep red, on the steel beams that run the length of the ceiling. And here you can see these beautiful north-facing skylights that she would have worked under. And if you can believe it, peeking in through the windows, that blue linoleum floor is intact, and it's gorgeous. And they have a dehumidifier running, so I have hope. I have hope about this. Not only did she create a studio, she created a sanctuary for Amelia. Had a bedroom, a sitting room, fireplaces, bath. And again, these are great details. I mean, look at the sink, these modern sort of details, the lamp, ceiling lamp, the AP towels. It's a great touch there. So we haven't even gotten to her crowning achievement yet, and it is the solar house. And once again, that was because of Amelia Peabody. She built what came to be known as the Dover Sun House, completed it in 1948, the very first solar house that had ever been built in the United States, and it was also occupied for many years. And the picture I have up there on the screen now, you can recognize Eleanor in her hat, and the other person in that picture is Maria Telkes. And Maria Telkes was a researcher at MIT, and she was a physical chemist. And it really was this collaboration of three women, Amelia Peabody, Maria Telkes, and Eleanor Raymond, that brought this into being. And I will not give you a tortured description of this, although I think my research assistant, Micah, would really like me to do that, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. But essentially, what you're seeing are photographs of the system and how it worked. Because Maria Telkes was a chemist, she was working with materials, and one of those was called sodium compound, a kind of sodium compound called Galubers, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, salt. And that sodium compound would go into those barrels that were metal. And what this sodium compound, its characteristic was that it would absorb heat. And then these salts, when they would melt, and it would release that heat. So you had a kind of radiant heat that could happen. So what would happen is, here you see a fan. And the fan would. Let me go back to this picture. So you have these south-facing windows, glass, and you had these thin metal sheets behind them that trapped the heat. Then you had the fan that blew the heat down to where these cylinders were, and these cylinders would have been placed in between the rooms. So you see bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, and that space in between would have been piled up with these cylinders, and they would absorb heat and then they would radiate it. Now, it did fail after, I think it wasn't until like 1950 something, and a traditional heater was put in. But that house, and I have someone who knows about it here, that house was lived in for a long time. It's great. It got torn down, which is very, very sad. And someone built it with solar panels, but somehow that's just not the same. I'm kind of getting near the end of my talk, and I'm going to return close to home. I'm going to come back to Muscle Point. And Muscle Point, if you don't know, it is on Dolliver's Neck, and it was near Gloucester, and we have there's a very amazing sort of artifact that researchers very rarely get to have, and that is a diary that was written. And Ethel kept a diary. There's a picture of it. And she had these diaries, and they are in the archive at Harvard from 31 to like 45. And she only kept them in the summer. I think that's when she had the leisure and time to do it. And what I understand from her, if you look at the way it's been put together, she clearly probably wrote it in longhand at the time, because, I mean, who has time to type anything at the end of a long day? None of us. And she transcribed it. And in fact, at the end of one of the diaries, this is confirmed, where she says, transcribed without deletions, additions, or other amendments. Now, there was very few things that were scratched out because there was nothing written there to scratch out. She was not going to be confessional in these diaries. It was often just about the day-to-day. But you get a sense of kind of her personality, and you get little insights into Eleanor that are sort of wonderful. And Ethel understood that Eleanor, and here's a picture of Ethel late in her life. They both smoked like chimneys, both of them. Here's a picture of Eleanor in the garden at Muscle Point. So Ethel, if Eleanor didn't, understood that her love of her life, Eleanor, was important. And there's this wonderful, and here's one of those things you come across and you just can't, it kind of takes your breath away. But there's this wonderful entry in Ethel's Gloucester diaries from October 1952. And she's noting that they have just recently had an appointment with a lawyer to draft their wills. And she says, Eleanor has left me everything, but I have nothing tangible to leave her except these diaries. And even then, she must read between the lines. A will doesn't seem to be the place for sentiment, so it must remain here unwritten. And I think that says a lot about the relationship that they had and the partnership that they had. They were very busy in Muscle Point. I mean, Eleanor was always busy. Eleanor never wanted to stop working. Eleanor wanted to stop moving. You know, she built buildings. They put a huge garden in. Here's a great picture. Do you recognize Eleanor? Do you know? Guess which one she is. You can tell, right? And what's great is, for better and for worse, Ethel really was her Alice B. Toklas to Gertrude Stein. You know, unfortunately, they kind of split those gender roles. So Ethel kind of stopped working in her mid-50s full-time at House Beautiful. She became the person who, as she says, looks like I might be the cook for the winter. In other words, they hadn't hired someone. And here's a note where she says, E, she calls her E, rebels at sweeping, and we plan to find a maid. Eleanor just won't put up with it. So, but Ethel sort of ends up being the one to kind of manage the household. and have less of a professional career. There's also a detail where they list all the books they read and all the meals that they cook, and I have these long lists of the books they read and the meals they cooked. It was wonderful, and she talks about Ethel, of course, was the one to read aloud to Eleanor, and she says, "I have learned to read in my sleep, but Eleanor hasn't learned to listen." She would always fall asleep. And they describe, being around sort of a wood stove, and she would describe like another Gloucester dinner, which would be like scrambled eggs, for dinner and hot chocolate. And they were always going out on the rocks and having picnic lunches. Here's another picture of them in the garden. I think that's Ethel now who's standing. And of course, there was a garden, and there was a vegetable garden, and there was a flower garden. And guess who tended the vegetable garden? Ethel tended the vegetable garden. And Eleanor just stayed amongst the roses and amongst the beauty. That was what she cared about. Here's a picture of her on the porch. They were very social, and Eleanor more so than Ethel. Ethel talks about how Eleanor gets her energy from people. I don't think she could have worked as tirelessly in such a, with so many clients over so many years unless she sort of had that capacity to sort of maintain herself amidst so much intense interaction. Ethel says she gets her energy from reading. She's a little more quiet and withdrawn. But, constantly, they had guests every weekend at their place in Muscle Point. And they also had some people who lived up here, somewhat eccentric. And I think you might have heard of one of those in her circle of women, which is Natalie Hays Hammond. Again, a little less well-known than her well-known brother, John Hammond, who built the Hammond Castle. But she built something equally eccentric, which was by Eleanor Raymond. Here it was on Dolliver's Neck, and here, who has heard of the Nancy Hays Hammond compound? Natalie Hays Hammond compound, sorry. Here's a picture of it. Here's another picture of it. Here's another picture of it. And so she was eccentric, never married, lived in this compound with two other women. She had Eleanor design it for her in the 1940s. It looks like it was built in the 1600s. That was very deliberate on her part. She was sort of a mystic and kind of past lives and, sort of romanticizing, she named her place after a castle over in Ireland. There's a great Eleanor makes the point that she really tried to convince Natalie to connect the buildings because they were going to live there full time because of the wind and the cold, that they would really be better off if they were to do that, but she says they wouldn't have it. I think Natalie probably wanted a little bit more of her personal space and wasn't willing to live as communally. There were two other women, I only have their last names. It was Connard and Laughlin. One of them was an actress. And there was an entry in the diary from 43 where it says, Connard living in Laughlin's house during fall of 1943 as Topsy had died. Topsy, who was Topsy? Child? I don't know. Turned out to be, well, Connard had a small office, Eleanor would have designed this, that adjoined her bedroom, specifically designed to house the actress's pet monkey. There you go. It's great. So, I now am going to give you a treat and show you some contemporary images of Muscle Point. And you can see the original cottage there on the porch, it's painted white. Here's another view of that. Here's the porch that we saw Eleanor sitting on. There's the view they had. Here's the garden, and the bones of that garden are still there, which is marvelous. And that building is not original to the cluster of buildings that Eleanor had. It's a new building, but in looking at this diagram, you can see that they had raised beds, and there's the gate, same metal gate that they had. And there's their design for how they lived around this garden. Here is a building that survives, that's been taken away just off into the woods a little bit, preserved, I'm happy to see. Maybe needs a bit of restoration. But this was this would have been part of, not adjoined, but connected around what in that courtyard you saw, and that was the guest bedroom. And that person had room for a bed, and they had their own front porch. It was very nice. And the other thing.
Actually connected to the back of the cottage, and that was her studio, and there was a drop table in the front of the screen that no longer exists where she drafted.
Oh, that's so awesome. Thank you, Albert. I thought I'd heard that story, and then I thought I'd made it up. Oh, that's so great. So that's where she worked. That was her studio. That's so great. And you'll see there's a little bit of light blue there. And Eleanor loved that color. It got to be called even the Raymond blue. And she insisted on all of the garden tools, the wooden handles being painted light blue. So she was like into the details. So I just wanted to leave you with this, beautiful picture is how it looks today and how it would have looked for them. And there are many entries in Ethel's diaries about how much they both valued Messel Point. And I just wanted to read one of them to you. Beautiful moonlit night. E and I walk on the terrace, arm in arm, and congratulate ourselves upon such a possession. And I'm just very glad that Anne, Seymour, and Albert and their family still get to have their own little piece of paradise there and appreciate it. So thank you very much. Now, I can't imagine I haven't already barraged you with so much information, but I am here for questions if anybody has them. And I think there's people here who know more than I do, who've met Eleanor Raymond, and they can come up here and hold forth or tell us the story. Please feel. You want to do that? You want to talk about your connection to Eleanor? Do you want to, Anne, Seymour, do you want to talk a little bit about the house or anything like that? Come up and share that or speak from your chair? Or Albert, you grew up with Eleanor. You remember her, right?
Well, I did notice that there were 2 points at which you omitted perhaps a little bit of uncharacteristically more emotion. One was when you were describing how there were people in that era who would not marry a woman who was more well-educated than they. And I was wondering if there was anything in your research that gave rise to the proposition of Eleanor having ever fallen in love with anything as despicable as a man.
I don't think so. No.
And then my other question was, also, I thought that you were a little bit more strong in your vehemence about how Eleanor's mother had been driven crazy by a father who had decided that she was put on this earth to do nothing but bear children for her. For him. And so, was there anything in the research that expanded upon between daughter and father?
No, there wasn't. No. I just, you read, that's good. I mean, you read enough about the movement for birth control and all the reasons that it became such an important issue for women. Initially were women and people like Eleanor, Eleanor's class in education, middle class, were advocating very strongly for the sort of lower classes to sort of help women not be having these enormous families, because it was just really destroying their health and making their economic life impossible. And then, so it really started there. But that was my own perspective. Yes.
I think Eleanor created the bumper sticker, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And she was very loving, and I had the incredible good fortune, my late wife and I were courting and romancing, and my late wife was the next door neighbor, and we spent half a dozen tea parties with Eleanor in that little enclave.
Amazing.
And it was so sweet, and she was so dear, and her color blue was so resonating, her brilliance. And she was just sincere and genuine and sweet and brilliant and clear. And as lovely a human being as you could ever meet. And her little tea house and her incredible enclave was heavenly. And the Ellises living next door have kept it and, taken it to a whole new place with their beautiful family. And that picture really says it all. When you're so blessed and so fortunate to look out at that, it's like, oh my God. And Eleanor, I never met her mate, but it was thereafter, and she just couldn't have been sweeter, and no edge, no anger. I mean, I as a young enthusiast of the male species represented a lot that would not be approved of or could easily be disdained. And of course, I've on rare occasion experienced that, but never from Eleanor Raymond. I mean, that lady was a sweetheart, period.
I'm so sure.
That's the case. So sure of that. Yeah. Yes, you had your hand up there because you have a story, right?
I feel as though I have to stand up. Can I use your, because
Come. You can
I don't
stand
know,
here.
can you all hear me without?
Okay. Yeah.
Because you can see I'm not at my best at age 90, but I would be remiss not to tie together themes that will even surprise Mac, because I married Joe Garland in 1978. I came to Gloucester, had no idea that my ancestors had come and also lived here down from Newbury, and he was a little put off at that because he thought I was something else from Richmond, Virginia, and so did I. That said, no, my ancestors came to Newbury in 1634, and so tonight has knocked me for a loop because it tells you so much about Joe, and it tells you what a jerk I was, because I met Eleanor because they loved what Joe wrote, and he loved every aspect. But it never occurred to me that I was now going to hear from you that there was a whole movement of women going back to my aunt at Wellesley. And they were, and then of course in 1961, I had a phone call from Margaret Mead. And I thought, I should sound professional, but my 4 children were throwing rocks down on me from the terrace, and I was trying to be so effective and responsible. And she asked me to observe at the United Nations for her, because my college had sent me to the UN in 1945. And I'm now 90, and I've lived long enough to hear this lecture and tell me the touch points, which would take another hour. But I took Joe into this world of power, women, and he was sort of dazed by it. I didn't realize that's what I was witnessing. And I had this aunt, I was named for her, Helen Reed Bryan, and she ended up defying the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was a little debutante from the South, but she ended up going to the same prison as, who's the woman that went there recently, Alderson? Anyway, for all these political things, that age group had a whole network that I did not understand until I heard your wife speak. So I cannot thank you enough for letting me know and look back that when I met Eleanor, she was probably 80, maybe 75. Well, you could do the math. It was 78. And she had designed the house 2 houses away from me. Now, I'm on 95 Eastern Point, so she would be 91, the one she designed.
What was the name of the
And it is
Who
absolutely
she designed
gorgeous.
it for?
But
Remember who she designed it for? Who she would, the family who lived there originally?
it was a woman that she had designed it for, and the trees that she arranged in front make it a magnificent place. It's just a pleasure to go by. And she built it totally of cinder block. So then, somehow, when we went to cocktail parties, everybody was so excited to see Joe. And that I would be, I would be sitting there thinking, well, what shall I do? So I decided I would speak to the oldest person in the room at every cocktail party. And I met a woman who lived across the street from, tell me if I'm going on too long, that lived across the street from the church in, on the way to Anasquam.
Is that the
local
Chapel?
church. She lived kitty corner. And she told me she had become not wanting to marry or be, that her father helped her become a public relations person for the ballet. And I can't remember her name. Well, I never heard more interesting things. And she told me that she went to parties with Eleanor Raymond and Natalie Hammond.
Natalie.
And the parties would begin, I guess, in that area she designed, right across, next to
The woman you're talking about
Gloucester
is
Point.
the mother, the daughter married David Mamet. And it's the house on the right, just as you start going down around the swoop.
I think you're
Yeah.
practicing, but did I miss?
Anna Kraus. Is it
Anna
Anna
Kraus.
Kraus? Is it Anna Kraus you're thinking of?
No, it's the 16th century thing.
But we're talking about the Hammond compound.
And
now.
Natalie,
So the parties would happen at this compound?
yes, it was,
Yeah.
and they would have parties, and the dinner table was all set, and they could not start until the mouse appeared. Which was still there, which I saw later. Because somehow, separately, I met that woman who told me that Natalie was head of the Women's Army Corps for World War II, until she sent out an invitation to her female wedding. And so immediately, she was relieved of her duty. And so here I was, watching both worlds and not putting it together until tonight. And so, the next thing you know, I somehow get to know Natalie so well that when Joe and I went down to where I used to live, Hastings-on-Hudson, on the way back, I said, let's stop and see Natalie Hammond, because she was in northern Westchester by then with her partner. And so we went in, and I guess Eleanor must have designed it. She had a magnificent, huge home with flags in the main entry hall. I don't know how the language to describe it, but it was very impressive. And she had a museum, because then she could be tax exempt, she said. She said we had lunch in the great home, and she was sitting there thinking, feeling shy. That wasn't like him, because neither of us realized that there was this feminine network of that era that must have been really powerful. And I'll have to go home and think about this, because I don't know if something like that exists today, but I missed it. So.
Yes, the Natalie Hays Hammond, some of the things I began to uncover in the archive here, and her connection to the women's military, whatever, she got Ethel in uniform. I mean, she was, gathering all these women to do these war efforts and protect the coast. And there's some really funny things in Ethel's diary describing just kind of rolling her eyes around this whole military thing. And they thought Natalie Hays was a nutcase, and they just put up with her. But they have these great descriptions of just going to the house and talking to them about past lives and just kind of shaking their heads when they got home. So I love it that you met her. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Hi, yeah.
We bought the guest house in the Hammond compound in 2001.
Oh, you did?
And in the attic, which we still have, I don't know what to do with, is a huge box of architectural drawings from Eleanor.
Whoa! Are you kidding me? Does the K-Band Museum know about this? Can I get your phone number?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's wonderful. And I saw no way to enter that fortress without, I was really kind of intimidated, so I'd love to come and see your place. Thank you. Oh, this is such a place to give this lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you.